In the first ever interview podcast episode on Friends and Fellow Citizens, a special guest and staunch supporter of this podcast will join us in an exclusive conversation about the history of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Let's begin. Patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Welcome, everyone, to our first guest episode and the second episode overall in this podcast, Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman. Thank you so much for joining us today and for listening. I really appreciate all of your support, and I really hope that this episode and many episodes down the line will be especially useful for you as we explore how we can apply George Washington's principles to politics, to culture, and our everyday lives. And don't forget, make sure you subscribe to this podcast and share it with your friends and family. And now I'm joined by a very special friend of mine and a staunch early supporter of this podcast. I cannot thank him enough for all the support he has given me throughout this journey so far and for the future. I want to welcome Denzel Johnson, a great friend, a great patriot, and a fellow student whom I got to be with for 2 years. We met back in 2018. And we both graduated from the same school, the Bush School of Government Public Service at Texas A&M University. And I just want to welcome him and thank him for his great time and energy today. Hi, Denzel. How are you? Good to be with you today. And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thank you again, Sherman, for inviting me to have this discussion on an important topic related to the Middle East. I think it's a really important subject matter to focus on these days. As far as myself, just a quick background for everyone. My name is Denzel. I graduated with Sherman from the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University. I concentrated, in my master's in intelligence and American foreign policy. However, the majority of my, coursework when it comes to regional interest has mostly been in the Middle East. I've taken a few others in Asia and Latin America, but I've always had this real interest toward the Middle East. And prior to that, I did my undergrad at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, got a bachelor's in political science, and that's also where I'm originally from. I grew up in the Aloha State, so decided to come all the way out here, College Station, Texas, to study international affairs.
Well, thank you for that, Denzel. Don't forget that you bring the Aloha spirit to the mainland. So very great to have you today. Let's start with the aftermath of the Second World War. I think this is a good time to start because we're seeing a drastic change in America's standing in the world as a big superpower alongside the Soviet Union at the time. And the U.S. relationship with the Middle East got quite interesting, especially during the Cold War, when the Soviets tried to exert their influence on a number of Middle Eastern countries, including some countries in North Africa as well, don't forget. So let's start off with that time period and tell us a little bit about what had happened soon after a very, very bloody conflict and how U.S. relations with the Middle East started to really shape up as products of intelligence operations from the CIA.
The Middle East is one of those really interesting regions. You can pretty much say that about any region. But in the Middle East, there's a lot of different, I would call them, moving parts, whether it's with respect to the American influence, British influence, tribal and religious conflicts, Israeli-Palestinian conflict, Sunni Shiite splits, and you have any vast array of things. As with respect to post World War II. That's a lot of stuff happened. With um, throughout that time period, and given that from you know that time period till now, it's a very long stretch. So I kind of decided to focus on really kind of stuff that happened immediately, or at least close to immediately after that war, that Second World War, and I kind of wanted to concentrate it on specific administrations. During World War II, that's when Truman administration was there. From 1945 to 52, throughout that time period. And then afterwards, came in President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and this is just one of the three different things happened in that time period after World War II under the Eisenhower administration, with respect to Middle East policy. First and foremost, in 1953, we had the president, ordering the Central Intelligence Agency to, depose Mohammad Mossadegh, who was a popular, elected leader of the Iranian parliament, and an ardent nationalist who opposed British and American influence in Iran. As a result of this coup that happened, on the part of the CIA and whatnot, had it, it's arguably, was point where it kind of tarnished the U.S.'s reputation, at least in the eyes of the Iranians, as far as like losing trust, as because we came in and deposed their leader. Obviously, it was because he opposed one of the reasons he opposed British and American influence in Iran.
That's exactly right. Mossadegh was feared to have pro-communist views. It wasn't completely understood that he was a true communist, but he did sympathize with communist values. And when the British realized that their oil was potentially going to be cut off in terms of sales to Iran, and the threat from Mossadegh on cutting foreign investment into the country, the Americans and the British realized that they needed to do something to overthrow the Iranian government. And with quite a bold operation, the first attempt actually failed, but the second attempt, led by a grandson of former U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt, in this case Kermit Roosevelt Jr., with his leadership, they were able to throw out the regime and install back General Zahedi, who led the Shah, and the Shah eventually ruled in Iran for several decades until 1979. So it was quite a successful operation. I think it would be a really great episode to look more into some of these really daring intelligence missions and to understand a bit more about how they really shaped the U.S.'s role and the U.S.'s power as a superpower and as a very adept country that can use intelligence for huge cases and for huge policy decisions that could change the world. We unfortunately don't have time in this episode to cover every major event and every major relationship between the United States and Middle Eastern countries, but one particular area I want to focus on, and it is a country technically in North Africa, but I think it had a lot to do with, of course, a very familiar U.S. ally named Israel. And I'm talking about the Suez Crisis here. The Suez Crisis was a huge turning point for the United States, especially given the fact that other powers such as the UK and France were declining in power already after a brutal Second World War. But the Suez Crisis not only helped the Egyptian president Nasser, but it also solidified Eisenhower as a true champion of this anti-communist movement that really started to kick off much in the 1950s or so. And the daring move by Eisenhower, I think, is just really extraordinary when you look at these stakes and when you look at that impeding power of the Soviet Union, and that concern that the Soviet Union could have used the Middle East with all its oil reserves, with all of the potential geopolitical advantages that it could have. There was all this concern, and I think the Eisenhower administration did a really great job in addressing that and putting America at the top in terms of superpower status.
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of interesting when I saw that, when I was kind of doing my own research and whatnot, preparing, I remembered that I had taken during my American foreign policy class, at the Bush School, I was in a group, and we actually presented on this after reading a book. It's called Containing Arab Nationalism by Salim Yaqub. And essentially, just, the background about it was, I think one thing, to understand about the Suez Crisis was that, it's just obviously in Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser was in charge and essentially, nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. And, this really, caused great concern, within the U.S. In my book, well, in that book, that I read, it describes the role, like, that this played with respect to the Eisenhower Doctrine. In the book, Yaqub describes the role of, the Eisenhower Doctrine of, within U.S. foreign policy, by providing a historical foundation. During this period, the U.S. was engaged with the struggle against, the spread of communism by the Soviet Union, while, the British were perceived to be losing their credibility within, this region because of this Suez crisis. And therefore, the administration, Eisenhower administration, interpreted this, I would call it, power vacuum, spread of communism, to influence the region. During this time period, it's important to know that, we're still U.S. and, I would argue, Europeans as well are, still kind of concerned, just about I guess, the horrors, per se, and the threat, I guess, of, communism and Red Scare and whatnot. So really, this, when, Nasser was really able to just come over and, just kind of do his own thing and take over the, canal. This is when the U.S. was kind of like, okay, we need to, really kind of do something about this, and in an effort to, deter the spread of international communism and whatnot.
That's exactly right. I think it's hard for the current generation and future generations and those who never lived around that time to really reflect on the significance and the impact that had on world relations.
Each different period or chapter of, American foreign policy has like their thing, right? Their focus. Nowadays today it's COVID-19, right? But back then it was communism, right? Here's the thing: if the British, and French, they were failing at this, right? They were they're essentially failing at losing their credibility in the region. Had the U.S. not grab hold of this power vacuum, I think it could have been a lot worse. I know a lot of people argue that the U.S. intervention in the Middle East has made things worse and whatnot. And I agree that there are some things we've done, at least the way that we went about it, that may not have been the most, the wisest decision. However, American ability to come to the forefront of leadership when necessary has produced a wide variety of positive effects for not just the Middle East but the whole region as well. And I think that definitely President Eisenhower was really good. Definitely I supported that. I think it was really necessary for him to do that, and as opposed to just kind of letting that. And we'll kind of get into more of that later. But power vacuums are like dangerous, right? Somebody's going to take power. And if it's not the U.S., then, I mean, honestly, the next, biggest, influence could have been the Soviet Union coming in. And I don't see why they would not, right? I mean, they, talk about later on in Afghanistan and whatnot. Like, they could very well do it.
You're absolutely right. I think schools nowadays really need to teach this and show kids that this was a really big deal when it came to not just the threat of power competition coming from another world power, in this case, the Soviet Union, but it also is about the threat to people's daily lives and people's right to live freely. And a big country, a decisive country that stands for good, has to take some kind of action. And that action has to be a major thrust of power projection.
Yeah, definitely. Just a quick note, just to add to the last point. When you're talking about power projection, I think really that was the thing. If the U.S. wanted to be an influential voice in the region, like they needed to project their power. And as the British and French were losing their credibility in that region, the only other way that the U.S. was able to project their power would be to be in the region. And if they're not in the region, then the Soviets could get in, right? Um, there was that. So as far as Lebanon, that was a lot of that's a very another interesting um, crisis that happened in 1958, Lebanon crisis. Basically, what had happened was 2 years after, I guess, yeah, 2 years after the Suez crisis, there were nationalist forces roiling the Middle East and threatening to topple Lebanon's, I guess you call it Christian-led government. Um, while and during this time period, Eisenhower, would ordered the first landing of U.S. troops in Beirut to protect the regime. So, like, here's the thing. So during this time, there was this political crisis, caused by political and religious tensions in the country, led to this U.S. military intervention, and the um, the operation, which the name of the operation that was Eisenhower authorized, was called Operation Blue Bat, July 15, 1958. This is really interesting. When I was doing my research, this was said to be like the first, I guess. I mean, you could also say the Suez Crisis as well, but as far as a full scale operation, this was the first, I guess, application of the Eisenhower doctrine as far as large scale, where the U.S. Announcing that it would intervene, protecting this regime that they thought would be threatened by international communism. And the entire goal, or I guess the long ballpark, you know purview of the end thing was to you know essentially strengthen the pro-Western Lebanese government, President Camille Chamoun, against opposition groups and threats from Syria and Egypt, which are posing a threat to them. And the entire plan was really just to basically serve as occupying and securing the Beirut, out there in Beirut International Airport, a few miles south of the city, and then secure the port of Beirut. The thing with this is, like, the U.S., once the crisis was over, United States, withdrew. The U.S., American, Lebanese government forces, successfully occupied the port and the international airport, and right when we, right when we got to our end goal, we left. We had a clear exit strategy, which is something interesting. We can get into later topics of things we've done in the Middle East where we didn't have a clear exit strategy.
Well, certainly any kind of entrance strategy requires an exit strategy. Otherwise, you're basically stuck, metaphorically and even physically. I think the operation really is something that is worth reflecting. And of course, this is just one of many operations that Eisenhower participated in and led throughout the time of the Cold War, throughout his presidency. What is interesting about these particular divides between Muslims and Christians, and not just in Lebanon, but in many other countries as well, is that those divides still continue today. And around the time of this recording, Lebanon is facing a major political and economic crisis with hyperinflation, with discontent with the establishment. And so even years, even with the Lebanese Civil War and political reforms that try to balance a particular religion so that one particular religion sect did not have too much power over another. We still have these divides going on nowadays. It's going to be really challenging to see and how a resolution and how a long-term resolution can ensure stability and peace in Lebanon and across the Middle East. To move on just a little bit, one of the first things that came to my mind when I thought about this topic was a really watershed moment that happened in 1979. And of course, I'm talking about the Iranian Revolution. Under Eisenhower, we, of course, supported the Shah, as we discussed earlier, but unfortunately that didn't last. And I just cannot begin to imagine the pressure and the humiliation, frankly, when the Iranian protesters and rioters broke into the U.S. Embassy, relations deteriorated, and the Shah was overthrown, and the Ayatollahs came to power.
Yeah, definitely. When I was trying to think about this based on everything I've studied and thinking about significant political upheavals in the Middle East and contemporary U.S. foreign policy, honestly, really the first thing, amidst everything else I've written down, it was really the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And, here's the thing about that, out there, it was essentially, a series of, events that, demonstrated, I guess their rejection of the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who supported the U.S. and in place of him, they wanted an Islamic Republic under the Grand Ayatollah, Ruhollah Khomeini, who they still have. They still have an Ayatollah Islamic-led government, and the Iranian Revolution, like it is one of them. We have every country, every region has like their, I guess, signature things that really impact what impact the entire region and how the outcome and whatnot. And yeah, really, it was just they were just very displeased with just the Shah and the leadership of everything the Shah. I think that their dissatisfaction or their kind of rejection of the Shah is kind of part and parcel of obviously the Shah which we propped up supporting the U.S. and whatnot. So when they kind of want to lash back, I think that, and we know that had lasting effects on the entire region as a whole, right? After that, the establishment of a Islamic-led government.
Yes, and this discontent and dissatisfaction really bubbled over those couple decades or so. And it's just one of those examples where in foreign policy, it just feels like it's almost the art of moral dilemmas and managing moral dilemmas. Because on the one hand, you do have some very, very angry people who hate this foreign intervention we did back in the 1950s. But on the other hand, we certainly don't want to create any more enemies in Iran.
I understand kind of where they were coming from. I don't necessarily agree with it. I understand where they're coming from. See, look, they, wanted to overthrow this leader in 1979. Which we, propped up and whatnot. After, if we rewind a little bit, after we in 1953, overthrew their democratically elected prime minister in Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, and then put the Shah there. Shah was it's in simple terms, modernizer, promoting, modern economy, middle class, allegedly championing women's rights. He was known to not really support a lot of the Sharia law requirements, such as wearing a full body veil, like hijab or hijador, um, encouraging women to have educated and advocating for employment opportunities as well. People's discontent however, was just that they just thought he was ruthlessly, suppressing dissent, jailing and torturing political opponents, and I guess Iran, in their eyes, became a police state, and their reforms, concerned a lot of people. Some of the rights for women, angering Shiite clerks such as Ayatollah Khomeini, who fled into exile in Iraq and later in France, beginning in 1964. So here's the thing: I think it's just kind of interesting because we put him in power because we wanted to keep him there as someone that for us. But I think what had happened here, which arguably could happen in many other cases, was we put him here for a reason and didn't necessarily go everywhere the way we wanted to go. So like you were saying, it definitely had a negative effect on the administration. We didn't support it, some of this stuff that Shah may have did necessarily. Um, we appreciated his support, for the U.S., but I think some of the stuff he did, were really out of line per se, and it kind of just damaged our credibility. Same thing in other places in Latin America. Whatnot, we put these people up and oh, everything's fine, and then they go throw out a left fielder, and it's like we didn't put you in there to do that. So yeah,
Yeah, it is a bit of a shocker, especially when you look at the timing as well. It just could not have happened, I don't think, at a worse time for President Carter than about the time when you have the Republican primaries and you have an election coming up. Certainly not something that I don't think anyone really wants to go through. But then again, this is the way politics is. There's always these ups and downs. There's always these changes. And I think the best thing is just to be ready for them, to look out for the signs when discontent people are going to rise up and declare that they want a new way of living. And whether or not that succeeds is really up to the will of the people and, of course, the ability for people to be able to practically topple an existing government. But I think the hard part, and this is something we're going to explore a lot more when we go into more depth and detail about different regions like the Middle East, Asia, South America, and that is part of these revolutions, that you need a good exit strategy in itself. I think in this case, an exit strategy would be a new way of government, but a new way of government that does not bring back some of the horrors, or if not most or all of the horrors of a regime which you had despised and a regime which you tried to topple. And before we get into our second segment, we are going to take a quick 20-second break. I've included a break with some background music for all of you so that you can take whatever break you like and resume the episode whenever you can. Back after this. Welcome back to our second segment of this episode on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. Denzel, now let's turn to something else that we had chosen before this recording. We both graduated from the Bush School of Government and Public Service, of course named after the 41st president, George H.W. Bush. And one of his landmark foreign policy missions was Operation Desert Storm and the war against Saddam Hussein. Taking place in Kuwait, the war was incredibly catastrophic when you look at the bioterrorism that happened, especially with the oil fields and all that. It's really, really scary stuff what the Hussein regime did. Walk us through the first Gulf War and the impact it had on U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East.
Yeah, definitely. Persian Gulf War, or people would call it the first Gulf War. And, there were, this was really interesting because the whole issue was that essentially that the Saddam Hussein ended up going into Kuwait. He left Iraq and went to Kuwait, who he had also owed money to, and decided to invade them and everything. And he refused to leave. Even though there was pressure, and whatnot, and essentially the U.S. our namesake Bush Goal, was able to build a coalition and there. And here's the thing, the significance of the Gulf War. Um, there, obviously there's a lot of oil, resources in the Middle East, right? That's a really huge thing there. Um, During this time, there were, you know, a new, I guess you call it, multitude of efforts, diplomatic efforts that were repeatedly unsuccessful. Attempts to meet with Iraq's foreign minister Tariq Aziz. There were human rights violations. United Nations, Amnesty International, Arab League. They all condemned Hussein for doing it. The UN passed Resolution 660. The international condemnation of what Saddam Hussein was doing and whatnot, and you know the the entire, I guess, the international context behind that was there was a the whole invasion happened around August 1990, and 140,000 Iraqi military personnel at the Saudi Arabian Kuwaiti border, and really Saddam Hussein he was really intent on going in, right. He wasn't gonna you know hold back and everything. And we asked him, look, here's the thing, I found this really interesting cartoon, which I'll send it to Sherman later. But yeah, really, it was like we had asked him, Saddam, like, we the UN, we all came. We're like, you need to leave, after, like, by this certain day. He refused to leave, multiple occasions, and like our priorities here, our priorities, with going in, at least with the Gulf Party, was, we wanted a complete and unconditional withdrawal of all Iraqi forces from Kuwait, the restoring of the legitimate government in Kuwait, protect American lives, of course, and enhance security and stability in the Gulf region. Iraq, well, Saddam Hussein specifically rejected, this peace resolution. He, was intent on staying there, and after even people within the Arab League, look, here's the thing, like the January 15th, let's just break it down real quick. January 15th, 1991, the Iraqi withdrawal deadline was neglected. Then the 17th, U.S. coalition, launched attacks in Iraq and Kuwait. And then February 16th, Saddam announced his withdrawal from Kuwait. And then March 3rd, finally, Iraq accepts the terms of ceasefire agreement presented by General. And this was, put it this way, this went on far longer than it needed to, right? The deadline was the 15th, January 15, 1991. Saddam Hussein said no. He said, no, I'm gonna stay here. And one thing really interesting about this, and would not characterize, well, I wouldn't say that. Generally, I would say would not characterize most of our U.S. foreign policy operations in the Middle East after, I guess, 2000. Was just, the fact that, President Bush, he saw the issue, he weighed in, and, did what they said they needed to do. He built a coalition, and, got out. And like we were talking about earlier, right? Clear exit strategy. President Bush, HW, had a clear exit strategy with this whole thing. Went in, got out. So I thought that was really, the Gulf War is really interesting in that I appreciated that, that, unlike some other places we've been in the Middle East, there was a clear, like, okay, here's the issue. Here's how, Saddam's presence in Kuwait is destabilizing the region. Here's why you being the UN, y'all need to support, this coalition. And then they went in and they got the job done.
And President Bush certainly did. Really, really stunning stuff. For those of you who've not gone to the George H.W. Bush Museum, definitely should go. In College Station, beautiful campus, beautiful place. I'll probably mention it a lot more times, many, many more times later on during this podcast. But it just goes to show how important it is to have that decisive action. And I just want to add one thing to it, which is that during this time, it's really since the Vietnam War and all that, with the rise of technology, people could really see the actual footage of what had happened during the course of the war. And President Bush, I think, was very meticulous in being able to use that in I guess you could say, a PR kind of race against Saddam Hussein. Hussein really wanted to portray the United States as invaders, but the visuals and the live TV just could not lie to anybody about what was actually happening with Hussein's actions in Kuwait. Incredibly disgusting stuff from the Iraqi president. And I think there's no doubt that even several years down the line, during the Iraq War and all that, there was probably still that feeling within the U.S. government and amongst many voters who felt that Saddam Hussein still had to be taken out. And I think there was quite a bit of polling that came out right after the first Gulf War that showed that a vast majority of Americans really believed that Hussein needed to be held accountable. So we can't really discount that aspect of Saddam Hussein and the horrible actions that occurred when we talk about the Iraq War, which ran from 2003 to 2011. And one day that I think no one will ever forget, and that is September 11th, 2001, when almost 3,000 Americans were killed by 19 hijackers, terrorists who wanted to tear this country apart and destroy it. But it's the heroic people who went in those towers, the people who fought back against the hijackers over rural Pennsylvania, the dedicated public servants and heroes at the Pentagon. Those people are whom we need to think about when it comes to decisions on America's role in the world and the values that we stand for. Even though I was very young at the time when September 11th happened, it was a wake-up call. It was a wake-up call to current and future public servants. And when I first learned about it, I couldn't begin to imagine how a handful of people, could try to tear this country apart. And to this day, many Americans are still looking to fight for those who risked it all for this great country.
Yeah, man. Here's the thing, like you're saying, 9/11, it hit the American people, kind of like COVID-19, where where we thought we were untouchable, and it happened to us. And with the whole, with the whole thing in the Middle East and 9/11, the whole essence of that was, just bottom line up front, right? September 11th, 2001, a group of 19 terrorists, from Al Qaeda hijacked 4 different airlines in the U.S. attempt to commit the most devastating attack on the U.S. homeland. More than 3,000 American lives were killed in that dreadful incident. And, emotions, here's the thing, emotions remained high for American people in the following days after the incident. I mean, not even just the following days, but like following months. And here's the thing. Under immense pressure, and I learned a lot about this from this book called Power and Constraint. I read it for American Foreign Policy. So under like this like I don't know, like immense or just huge, high emotion stake. You know, Bush Jr., 43, his response, really just changed the course of American foreign policy in the future. In response to the 9/11 attack, first thing he did, right, was, he went and just really changed the trajectory of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, which I would say was relatively, I mean, we were active there, but not as much as we had been after 9/11. So, he, passed the Patriot Act, which was nowadays, we talk about it, some aspects are controversial per se, as far as some of the things, and as well as the um, authorization for use of military force, AUMF, which allowed, I guess the president to, a broad flexibility in using, military operations to, target and attack, terrorist cells, in the Middle East. Within the AMUF, the U.S. Has been held responsible for, a variety of, extrajudicial operations, such as renditions, intense interrogation, drone warfare, and Gitmo, which you can argue whether we need it or not. It's just what it is. What it is. It just happened, and I think at the core of it, here's the thing. The Bush administration's policies, were subject to much criticism in the foreign policy discussions. You know, during the election of President Obama, for example, he pledged to reverse some of these quote unquote illegal policy approaches. Um, However, you know, a lot of the decisions between the Obama administration and the Bush administration were quite similar. And, I think just the whole issue here was that, you know, it just was evident that, there's, broad rhetoric, without consideration for actualities in the decision making process was what led to, our initial knee jerk reaction to, just jump in and be like, we need to go to war, in the Middle East. And, like you said, tensions were, support was high. I think just President Bush, honestly, he felt the pressure to do something. We got, we got attacked. We need to do something. And it without really taking a step back. And, I've seen this before. Actually, I watched this similar political documentary. It's called, well, not documentary, it's a political drama TV show. It's called Homeland, kind of a CIA show. And same thing, president, some attack happens, and the president is like really like, the American people want a response. They want a response. So I think, I mean, I don't know if President Bush necessarily like thought it was the best idea. Maybe I think he was more concerned with um, being like, all right, we need to do something about it. And yeah, things went downhill from that, right? As public support diminished, as we thought there was WMDs, and it turns out CIA was totally off base with that, and just failure in the U.S. intelligence system. For not downing them or anything. It just is what it is. Even people that I know in intel community, they said, yeah, 9/11 was one of the hugest failures for the intel community, right? Because they, I guess they should have seen it coming, right? But during that time, there wasn't a lot of intelligence sharing between different agencies, right?
Right, exactly. And that's why the Department of Homeland Security was created to try to facilitate the Homeland Security measures and the policies under one administration or one department. Of course, we also saw that there were a lot of efforts to revamp the intelligence sharing with the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, and of course, the position of the Director of National Intelligence. And I think that even to this day, there is still this debate, the justification for additional bureaucracy, when in fact intelligence agencies really need to cooperate, work together with less bureaucracy, not more. I think the debate will still go on. I'm not saying that there is a perfect solution to intelligence sharing, but it was still of concern, of course. And the other thing to note is that I think the support and criticism of legislation like the Patriot Act are very justified because, on the one hand, we need to keep our country safe. We need to ensure that terrorists cannot take advantage of our telecommunication systems and our cybersecurity systems. But at the same time, one cannot just blindly assume that no rights or no individual rights can be trampled on with additional surveillance and additional collection of data. Whether or not surveillance is happening in one instance or another is hard to discern. However, there has to be just a better system, a better way for people to do things. It's not just about one piece of legislation and telling people that they're protecting people on one end, and on the other hand, there's security systems that are in jeopardy. There's a lot of reflection that has to be done, I think, to rethink how intelligence is reorganized. And I think it's much better to be more proactive rather than being defensive. I think that's something that we also need. Fighting extremism, radical Islamic extremism, should be a top priority all the time. And of course, it has to be calculated. We have to ensure that we are respecting those who freely practice their religion in the Muslim community. But at the same time, we cannot be afraid to go after what is truly evil, and that is radical Islamic terrorism.
Yeah, I think just the topic of radical extremism has been just thrown out there in the media and different political discussions, and it kind of gives rise to this whole concept of like Islamophobia and whatnot. And point of clarification, just disclaimer. I have many friends who are of the Islamic faith, who are Muslims and whatnot, and they're amazing people. So I understand that it's not all of them. There's like any other group, there's a small portion who are radical and kind of mess it up for the whole people. So I think for me, obviously 9/11 kind of brought 9/11, and this wasn't the first act of terrorism. There is um, many others back in Europe, Reign of Terror and whatnot, IRA, and but radical extremism, and I think really the whole thing is the whole issue why the Middle East just seems like it's just a place where that kind of stuff just happens all the time. And I think it really does have to do with just the way that how divisive some of the I guess ideological or religious like beliefs can be. With Al Qaeda, with ISIS, with all the other groups. I just think that here's the thing. Like our approach, I believe in I believe in the U.S. military. I believe in like the DoD and whatnot. I think that, however, the things we've done in the past have kind of exacerbated it in the effort. I would argue that some of the operations we've done, drone strikes and targeted attacks, even Gitmo and whatnot, I think some of that stuff exacerbated tensions. And I'm not saying that we need to have a diplomatic conversation with an Al Qaeda leader or ISIS leader, like how they're trying to do with the Taliban. I don't necessarily believe that, but I don't think that we're not gonna beat radicalism with bombs. Honestly, it really has to do with you know um, I guess really getting to the heart of it and just kind of cutting it off at the base. Because they are doing, especially ISIS. I think they were effective, put it that way, in their recruitment online, online radicalization, and they usually bring in people who are ostracized or oppressed and whatnot. In the Middle East, obviously that kind of a lot of stuff that kind of happens in the Middle East, but also in the U.S., they bring in, they're able to recruit people, but really just kind of attacking, from that front, just really just kind of seeing how we can, deal with, extremism and the recruitment, cutting off the recruitment, head and I think there is a place for bombs and you know, sending in SEAL teams. But I think also, we need to change our approach to, making a long lasting um, change because, yeah, we can't just bomb them forever on this. It's not going to work. And the only other thing I would say is like with respect to Islamic extremism, if you want to call it that, the degree to which it's a threat to the U.S. Back then, yeah, I would say it's. I mean, it was a threat. Definitely. After 9/11, right? They were targeting us and whatnot. Um, However, the more that I think about it today, or think about it right now, I don't. I'd be cautious about saying that they are a significant threat. I know that there are some of us, on different aisles of the spectrum that may think that radicalism is a huge problem and that needs to be dealt with, and that's an entire foreign policy. I don't necessarily think that. I think they probably honestly want to attack us or whatnot, but I just don't think they have the strength to do so. And we saw that with how the U.S. and 100 other nations were able to drive out ISIS out of Raqqa, and they're just like a small stream now. So they don't really have the strength to be a threat to us. However, we should definitely keep our guard up, but I don't think we should blow it out of proportion like it has been in the past.
I think what you said is absolutely right. I think when we look at any kind of threat, whether it's a cyber threat or a radical Islamic threat or a threat from the PLA or from drug cartel groups, whatever the threat is, we need to put into perspective. I think that's one of the things that needs to be always reconsidered, because as the world changes, as new events develop, as governments change, as societal and cultural events change, people who are in the national security sphere have to be aware of these changes and not to adjust or change anything for the sake of change, but to mitigate future threats, current and future threats. And I think at this time of the recording, we're facing a coronavirus pandemic. And I think a lot of people would argue that there is a threat from radical Islamic extremism. There always will be. But in terms of risk, there has to be an element of risk management and risk analysis. And that, I think, is what differentiates countries that have robust national security systems and countries who exhaust resources but are not putting the resources into the right places. I also do think that when it comes to fighting radical Islamic extremism, whether it's now or in the future, we always have to remember we have to name the enemy. We have to name exactly what we're fighting against. And as you said, we have to have all the tools necessary. We have to pull the weeds from the roots. Bombings and all that, those certainly can get rid of assets, get rid of ISIS and extremist resources. However, that should be complementary to our short-term and long-term vision for what we hope is a brighter future, and a future that can bring less violence and more peace in the region. I don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. No one has all the answers. But I think as long as we keep our vigilance, ensure that we devote the right resources, and we have great leadership, I think one day in the future, we will see a Middle East that might be much more prosperous, that we'll see the United States becoming a big player in that, maybe becoming a big role in that. I don't know when that's going to happen, but I think it has to happen. Something has to give. These conflicts and this extremism that's going on just can't last forever. this is going to be a multi-generation project and multi-generation movement that's going to bring more peace to the region. There's a long road ahead, but people have to start somewhere. People have to start somewhere, and to start somewhere good, and keep it that way for future generations. And now, before we get to our final segment, we are going to take our second and final break of this episode. We will come back very shortly in 20 seconds. And now we are in our third and final segment of this episode, talking about moments of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East since the Second World War. Denzel, we've covered quite a bit of ground, even though it feels like we've only touched upon a few key moments here. We really wanted to give the audience a sense of where U.S. foreign policy has gone. And I think there are some really key lessons here. There are many key lessons that I think people can draw from each of these cases, each of these policies, and think about the U.S.'s role in the world over the last several decades. I want to take some time now to reflect on some of the big takeaways that you believe are important for anyone who's interested in reading more about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, and how that ties in, I think, with the values of President George Washington, those values that we are going to talk about throughout this podcast: patriotism, faith, fiscal responsibility, civility, education, and national unity.
We covered a lot today. Obviously, by a lot, that's really just like hairspin of what's everything else that's going on. Since the Middle East has a long and very drawn out history, very really interesting history. If you study it sometime. But here's the thing: I think one thing you really need to understand is that most of the problems in the Middle East that have been and are continuing to go on is really just I believe that there are. At first, I think it really just started off with everything that happened after the world wars, when these countries were divided up and people were grouped together with different different backgrounds and different ethnic groups and whatnot, and with this the way that the lines were drawn in the Middle East, grouping these Kurds with these Kurds or whatnot, and I just think at the end of the day, the Middle East needs to really be understood as like a very complicated region. Not complicated in a bad way, but just like unique, like any other region, and that not every single place in the Middle East is different. You go to Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is not the same as Jordan, or not the same as Iraq, or not the same as Israel. Like each country has their own thing. It may seem like when we talk about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, like it's this big blanket. Well, honestly, they're each of the different countries. We just kind of group them together. They fall under that umbrella of the Middle East, but they have they're each interesting. They not all of them may have the same problems as other countries and whatnot, and not all of them deal with extremism as other places do, and so there's that. And I also think that it's just like I said, it's the tension within the different religious sects. There's the Sunni and Shiite sects. That and that has caused countries to fight proxy wars. We have the Saudi MBS Saudi Arabia just supporting one side. We have Iran supporting the other side, and just fighting these different wars in the Middle East and just causing more tension. And I think as the future of U.S. presence there is. I think that honestly, well, we should have done this a long time ago. Like we need to. I mean, this is easier said than done, but we really do need to find some kind of exit strategy. I think we've been there too long, particularly Afghanistan. I think we've been there way too long, and I think our problem that we kept running into is trying to promote democracy in countries that didn't want democracy the way that the Americans want democracy, or just involved with nation building and whatnot, which I don't think we need to be concerned with. I don't think that should be a foreign policy objective. I think that um, is not is not it is not always successful. There's only been a few cases when it has been, but if I were to pick one, it really has to be civility. And I think, like you were saying, look, we all of us, even policymakers alike, we have our own understand. Like we're like here we are. We're on a podcast. We're talking about Middle Eastern politics and whatnot, and we all have our different perspectives and intents and whatnot. And someone can listen to this podcast, and disagree with some of the stuff I said, and that's totally fine. My thing is that I really, and I've, for me, I've worked on both aisles, for Republicans and Democrats, and I've seen at the end of the day, it doesn't just have to do with foreign policy. It just, just policy in general. They all have, they all have, the best intent, and I think, just sometimes the execution, yeah, okay, whatever. Execution could be wrong, right? I get it, I didn't, some people didn't like, what so and so did in Asia or Middle East or whatnot. And it's like that's fine, but I think at the end of the day, one thing I think we need to do, and I think we're losing these days, is civility. I think it's really important to be able to talk, and I really think Middle East is, I mean, not just Middle East, but foreign policy seems kind of interesting in that most people think that foreign policy is like when you talk about foreign policy, it's more like, I wouldn't say like nonpartisan, but just more it like, I don't know, it just really like not as controversial as like if you're talking about like domestic politics and whatnot. But I mean, I still see people talk about how the U.S. did this and that at Guantanamo or this and this and the Shah and whatnot. But look, you can, I don't care what you believe. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, as long as there's people being civil, and I think I see that there's peaceful, peaceful things going on, and different demonstrations of people's beliefs. But I also see a lot of uncivility, and I think what will get this country moving in the best direction is if we can sit down and talk to our brother and sister on the other aisle and be like, hey, what do you think about this? And then just kind of sit there and look. I'm not saying everything be fine and dandy and be like, oh yeah, I'm gonna sit down. I'm about to agree with everything this guy says. Like, no, I'm not saying that. Like, or no, that's not what I'm saying. I think if you're able to have a discussion with people you disagree with, it does show a level of maturity. Because there's a lot of people at the Bush School that I had discussions with that I may not have agreed with their perspective on a specific foreign policy, but I was like, I didn't say like I hate you or anything like that. I was like, oh no, it's fine. Everybody has different perspectives, so civility. That's my thing.
Well said, my friend. I was going to go with civility as well, and that's probably the biggest virtue that we still need to live up to in the United States, even to this day. It almost seems like, regardless of the issue, it seems like civility always has to take a back seat, whereas it really should be in the driver's seat. I think civility is what drives conversation, drives progress. I think some people feel that they can just make progress with a quick rant and hurl a few insults and all that to people and think that that's progress. That is not progress. That is tarnishing one's brand, regardless of where people stand, right? I want to add fiscal responsibility to that, because whatever people think about President Trump, he has a point when he says that the United States spent trillions of dollars in the Middle East, and I think some people looked at that and said, we could have used that $7 trillion for something else. And others would have say, no, we should have kept spending that money. Maybe we should have increased spending. The point here is that the debate doesn't stop where you believe something so passionately. There's always a different side to things. And I think that's really going to be the common theme here when we talk about all these issues into greater depth. I mean, again, this episode really is talking about moments of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. But going back to your point earlier, Denzel, the Middle East really is complex when you look at all the different puzzles, different pieces, the moving parts, as you talked about way earlier in this episode. And when we think about those moving parts, we have to also think about the moving parts here in the United States as well, in terms of people's interests and people's concerns about different issues. Same thing with the threat levels. We have to be a lot more vigilant about that. And that all has to do with this idea of spending where we need to spend, not spending for the sake of spending and for expenditure of resources and cash on things that don't even mature to anything great and anything beneficial for this country and for other countries. So I would add fiscal responsibility to that. I think it ties in with virtually every single principle, but these two principles, I think civility and fiscal responsibility, you throw in national unity as well. You can throw in the other principles and the other pillars. And I think the other thing to note is that President Washington really called for a kind of independence, not isolationism, which is when a country completely distances itself from the rest of the world and other matters, but it's more of independence, whereas we do not intervene in affairs where the costs really outweigh the benefits. And I think there's a lot of discontent and, for the most part, justified discontent with the way our country has handled particular interventions. And as you say, we need an exit strategy. Going back to what we said earlier, any time you have an entrance strategy, you got to have an exit strategy. You got to find a way out, just like what Eisenhower did with his intelligence operations. You got in, you get the job done, you get out. I think we need to bring back that Eisenhower doctrine. And I can't wait to make an episode on President Eisenhower. I think he's a great man. I think he's a great president. And I think some would argue that he was probably the last most unifying president we've had up until 2020. That's up for debate, obviously, but Eisenhower was liked by both sides in many ways. And I really want to see perhaps some more Eisenhower-esque doctrine and leadership in the government right now. And we could go on and on, but I want to wrap up this episode here with a question I will ask each and every single one of my guests. This is something that I think is going to make this podcast especially special, and that is, who is your favorite founding father, Denzel?
Well, I really love my man Thomas Jefferson. The guy was a statesman, diplomat, lawyer, architect. The guy was a lot of things, And I really think what I liked about him is he was a huge proponent of, democracy, republicanism, and not in the party sense, but and individual rights. I think that it's like kind of his core, kind of thing. And he was the principal author, right, of the Declaration of Independence. So I think he's a solid person, to look up to.
Well, that's an excellent choice, my friend. Thomas Jefferson, boy, what a genius. What a thinker. What a creative founding father who really came up with some great ideas. And he was probably one of the most well-read people you will ever get to know. All I know, and when it comes to reading, I know I will read a lot in my life. However, I don't think I can beat Thomas Jefferson in terms of a reading competition. This guy read books and books and books. I don't know how he did it. I don't think he has left the secrets yet. Maybe it's hidden somewhere in one of his writings, but I think Thomas Jefferson really is a great choice, and he was the first Secretary of State, of course, under the first cabinet led by President Washington himself. He got into a lot of feuds, of course, with the Hamiltonians and the Federalists. Jefferson is one of the anti-Federalist, Democrat-Republican side. But nonetheless, I think that debate, the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate, I think is very interesting and something worth exploring for sure. Denzel, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate your time and energy coming on to this show and to give the very first guest episode on Friends and Fellow Citizens. And I really hope that future guests will be able to build on this episode. And I really want you to come back, my friend, and continue this conversation and continue to promote these values that we hold sacred, we hold dear, that will help guide this nation in the very long future. And thank you for listening and tuning in to this episode of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure that you subscribe and share this podcast with your friends and family. Until next week, take care, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.